The wind came in off the Atlantic at Land's End on the 23rd of September, 1641, and by nightfall the sea had turned into something no rope or timber was built to survive. Below decks, a candle or a spark found something it should never have touched, and a fire started in a hold packed tighter with wealth than almost any English ship before or since. By morning, the Merchant Royal was gone. Not run aground, not limping into a harbor with a story to tell, gone, straight down, into water off the Cornish coast, taking with her one of the largest fortunes ever loaded onto a single wooden hull. Silver bars, gold coin, jewels packed into chests that had never been meant to leave Spain in the first place. Modern estimates put the value of what went down that night somewhere north of $1 billion, and that number is conservative by some counts. It is, by most reckonings, more than what the Titanic carried, more than most of the wrecks that get documentaries and dive expeditions and gold rushes of their own. And here is the part that should make this stranger than almost every other treasure story you know. Nearly the entire crew survived. In an era when a fire at sea usually meant everyone died, the sailors of the Merchant Royal got off. The ship's master got off. The Fortune did not. That alone should have made this one of the most searched-for wrecks in the world. It has the paper trail, it has the number, it has survivors who gave accounts, officials who logged the loss, insurers who paid out on it. Almost every ingredient that turns a sinking into a centuries-long hunt is sitting right there in the historical record. And yet, after nearly 400 years, after sailing ships with grappling hooks in the 1600s, after Victorian salvage companies with diving bells, after 1990s expeditions with side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles built for depths no wooden ship's captain could have imagined, nobody has ever confirmed where she lies. Not a coin, not a timber, not a single verified piece of the Merchant Royal has ever been pulled from the seabed and matched to her name. This is not a story about a ship that is about to be found. This is a story about why one of the best documented fortunes in maritime history has managed to stay lost through every century that came looking for it, and what that says about the ocean floor off one of the most treacherous coastlines in Britain. To understand how something this valuable ended up on an English merchant ship in the first place, you have to go back a few months earlier, to a port in southern Spain, where a very different kind of crisis was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with treasure and everything to do with soldiers who had not been paid. In the spring and summer of 1641, Spain had a problem that had nothing to do with England and everything to do with money. Spanish troops garrisoned in and around Cadiz had gone unpaid for months, the kind of gap that turns soldiers with weapons into a threat against their own commanders. Mutiny was not a distant risk. It was already happening in pockets, and Spanish officials needed a fast, discreet way to move a very large sum of bullion to cover the wages before the unrest spread further. The problem was that Spain and England were not exactly allies, and Spanish law restricted foreign vessels from carrying this kind of cargo directly. So the solution was quietly practical rather than legal. An English merchantman, the Merchant Royal, under Captain John Limbury, was contracted, semi-officially, to carry the silver out of Cadiz. English ships had a reputation for speed and for surviving Atlantic crossings, and using one meant the cargo could move without drawing the attention that a Spanish treasure fleet would. What went into her hold was staggering even by the standards of Spain's American silver trade. Later estimates placed the load at roughly 100,000 pounds of silver bullion, alongside bars of gold and minted coin, on top of jewels privately loaded by merchants and officials looking to move their own wealth out of Spain quietly at the same time. Some of that private cargo was itself semi-legal or entirely undeclared, wealthy passengers and merchants paying to have their fortunes smuggled out under the cover of the official shipment. Picture what that actually looked like stacked in a wooden hold built 2 decades earlier for wool and cloth and ordinary trade goods. Silver bars stamped with assay marks, some worn smooth from handling, some fresh from the mint, with edges still sharp enough to catch a thumbnail. Gold in smaller, denser bars, the kind that a man could barely lift with one hand, cold to the touch even in a warm hold, heavier than anything else on board pound for pound. Coin bagged in canvas sacks that had to be double tied because the weight tore through a single knot. Jewels wrapped in cloth and packed into iron-strapped chests, quiet and small compared to the bullion, but worth a fortune of their own. The hold itself would have been dim, lit by a single lantern if any light was allowed near it at all, given what it held. The air below decks on a laden merchantman in the 1640s was thick, salt and tar and bilge water, the creak of timber working against the pull of the sea, a constant sound no one on board stopped noticing until something changed. That sound, and what happened when it did change, is where this story turns from a smuggling operation into a disaster. The Merchant Royal left Cadiz that August, part of a small convoy, riding low in the water under the weight of everything packed below her deck, bound for open Atlantic water and, eventually, for England. By the third week of September, the Merchant Royal was in home waters, off the far southwestern tip of England, near Land's End, a stretch of coast that sailors of the era already respected for its currents and its weather. Contemporary accounts describe a ship that had developed a serious leak, water working into the hull faster than her pumps were built to handle, the kind of problem that on a lighter ship might have been manageable, and on a ship carrying this much dead weight in silver became something closer to a countdown. The crew worked the pumps in shifts through the worsening weather, the kind of labor that blisters hands and burns lungs, men rotating in and out of a task that never actually gets ahead of the water, only slows how fast it wins. Then, according to the accounts that survive, a fire broke out in the hold, whether from a lantern, from friction, from sparks generated by cargo shifting against itself in rough seas. The exact cause was never definitively established. On a ship already fighting to stay afloat, a fire below decks turned a survivable emergency into something close to certain loss. What follows is the part of the story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The crew did not panic into chaos. They fought the ship for hours, trying to control both the leak and the fire at once, a fight on two fronts that very few vessels of that era ever won. Boats were readied. Men were organized for evacuation while others kept working the pumps and hauling water toward the flames, buying time for their crewmates rather than themselves. Captain Limbury and the overwhelming majority of the crew got off the Merchant Royal alive, taken aboard other vessels in the convoy, or, according to some accounts, reaching safety through their own boats before the ship finally went under. Historical accounts differ on exact numbers, but the consensus across the record is striking. This was not a disaster where the ship's loss came at the cost of her crew. It was a disaster where the ship and everything inside her went to the bottom, and the men who sailed her walked away to tell the story. That detail matters more than it might seem. Most of the treasure wrecks that dominate popular imagination came with a death toll, a tragedy layered on top of the loss of wealth, grief bound up with the gold. The Merchant Royal offers something rarer, a fortune lost cleanly, without a body count attached to it, which is part of why the story reads less like a tragedy and more like a mystery. Nobody died to keep this secret. The ocean has simply kept it anyway. Word of the loss reached England quickly, and the reaction was not quiet disappointment. It was closer to national shock. Contemporary writers describe the sinking as one of the greatest maritime losses in memory, a fortune large enough that its disappearance rippled through merchants, insurers, and officials who had staked money and reputation on that cargo reaching port. And almost immediately, people started trying to get it back. The search for the Merchant Royal did not begin decades after her loss. It began almost immediately, and it has, in one form or another, never really stopped. 17th and 18th century salvagers attempted recovery using the tools of their era: weighted grappling gear, divers working in nothing more than held breath or primitive diving bells, boats anchored over best guess coordinates based on secondhand accounts of where the ship went down. Every attempt ran into the same wall. The waters off Land's End are deep, fast-moving, and unforgiving, with currents strong enough to scatter wreckage and tides that made even locating a search area a matter of guesswork rather than precision. The historical record of exactly where the Merchant Royal sank is frustratingly imprecise by modern standards, built from ship's logs and survivor testimony rather than instruments. Distances from shore were estimated, not measured, compass bearings from memory. That vagueness, more than any single technical failure, is the real reason the wreck has stayed lost. You cannot search efficiently for a wreck when your search area itself is built on approximation. By the 20th century, the tools had changed enormously. Side-scan sonar could map miles of seabed in patterns human divers never could. Remotely operated vehicles could descend to depths and pressures no 17th century diving bell could survive. Modern treasure hunting and marine archaeology outfits mounted serious expeditions through the 1990s and 2000s, some backed by real funding and real expertise, working through the most plausible search zones off the Cornish coast based on updated historical analysis of the Merchant Royal's likely course and the point of her loss. None of them produced a confirmed find. Some returned promising sonar anomalies, shapes on the seabed that matched roughly the size and profile of a wreck from the right era, but promising is not the same as confirmed, and none of those anomalies has ever been definitively identified through recovered artifacts, ship's fittings, or cargo that could be tied to the Merchant Royal by name. As of today, no verified wreck site exists. That is not a gap waiting to be filled by the next expedition. It is the honest state of the historical record, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than teased as a discovery just around the corner. It is worth pausing here on a point of confusion that comes up constantly around this story. The Merchant Royal is not the Ship of Gold. That name belongs to the SS Central America, an American steamship that sank in 1857 carrying gold from the California Rush, found in the 1980s through a well-documented and ultimately successful deep-sea search, and recovered in stages over the following decades. The two ships are separated by more than 2 centuries, by an ocean's worth of different cargo, by different nations, different eras of shipbuilding, and completely different outcomes. One was found, one remains lost. Treating them as the same story erases what makes the Merchant Royal actually remarkable, which is precisely that hers is the story where the ending has never arrived. Given all of that, a documented cargo, a documented sinking, a documented near-total crew survival, and nearly 4 centuries of failed searches, it is worth asking why the Merchant Royal has not become a fixture of treasure-hunting media the way other wrecks have. Part of the answer is simple. A story without a discovery is harder to package than a story with one, harder to end, harder to promise a payoff for. But that absence is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. There is room here for real curiosity, an open case rather than a closed one, a wreck that has resisted every tool thrown at it for going on 400 years. Maybe that is exactly why the Merchant Royal deserves more attention rather than less. A find gets a headline, and then it gets a museum case. A mystery this well documented, this old, and this completely unresolved stays alive in a different way, in the same currents that took her down, in a coastline that has kept its secret through empires and technologies that came and went around it. Some treasures get more powerful the longer they stay lost, because the not knowing is the thing that keeps people looking, keeps people arguing, keeps people caring about a ship most of them had never heard of before today. So somewhere off the coast of Cornwall, under water that has changed very little in 400 years, a fortune that could rewrite what we think we know about 17th century wealth is sitting exactly where it landed on a September night in 1641. Where do you think she actually rests?